Monday evening, and he brought us what I thought was a very interesting and challenging sermon on the subject of reviling. I can confess to you, I'd never had heard a sermon on the sin of reviling, and furthermore, not only had I never heard one, I never preached one, and I never even considered carefully the sin of reviling. So I was particularly impressed with that study and found it to be very helpful and needful for me personally, and several of you commented that you felt the same way, that this is a serious sin that we need to be careful about. And so I commend that sermon that Steve Klein preached to us, and I hope that we all take to heart the importance of not reviling and not committing that sin. There were some questions raised, and different ones of you have mentioned it to me, about some of the comments that were made relative to our conduct towards civil government, and what we might say and what we might do and how we should act towards civil government. And so I want to address that just real quickly in our lesson tonight. We'll try to be brief, and actually we're going to call up an old sermon, one that we studied not all that long ago, concerning Christians and our relationship to civil government. I pointed out in that lesson that it's important for us. We might have one screen working, so watch over here. I pointed out that in all things we need to have the mind of Christ. We need to imitate Him, be like Him, and that's applicable and would be applicable in this particular regard. In regards to how we view and deal with civil government, we need to be like Jesus and have the mind of Christ. And so we're going to look at that just briefly in our study tonight. We stop to say thank you. We're glad that you're here. We have a great blessing in coming together here in the middle of the night on Sunday. Isn't it awful how the time has changed, and it's almost like we're meeting at midnight here, dark by 5 o'clock in the afternoon now that we've had the time change. But it is still a blessing to come to this well-lit place and be able to study together, worship God, and praise Him. Thanks for being here, and thanks for any and all who may be visiting with us. So what about being like Christ? Guys, just leave it. Quit playing with it. It's a distraction now. Let's just work with one screen. What about how Christ would have us to deal with civil government? Well, first of all, let's make the point, the well-established point, that civil government is divinely ordained. I think that is really important, and actually I believe that we ought to be grateful for government. Had you ever stopped to consider, we complain about government a lot, but have you ever thought what it would be like if we had no government? If there was no government at all? If every man was a law to himself? If there was no authority to regulate and control society? That would be a terrible thing. And so even when governments are not really very good sometimes, their very existence is a blessing to us, and we need to be grateful for it. And it is a sign of God's wisdom that He put civil government in place. In John chapter 19, when Jesus was standing before Pilate, Pilate said, "Speakest thou not to me? Knowest thou not that I have power to crucify thee? I have power to release thee?" Jesus answered, "Thou couldst have no power at all against me, except it were given thee from above. Therefore he that delivered me unto thee hath the greater sin." Note, Jesus didn't say you have no power. He didn't say you're powerless over me. Pilate, I deny that you possess any power. No, he said, though, that the power, the source of the power that was possessed by Pilate or any civil government, that the source of that power was from above. In the text that Jordan read for us, in the text that Damon read for us earlier, in Romans chapter 13, beginning verse 1, "Let every soul be subject to the higher powers, for there's no power but of God. The powers that be are ordained of God. Whosoever therefore resisteth the power, resisteth the ordinance of God, and they that resist shall receive to themselves damnation." That's a well-known text, but again it talks about civil government being instituted by God, and that we are to submit, that we should not resist the power that they possess. So again, Civil government's divinely ordained. It is surely a sign of God's great wisdom that He made civil governments for our good and for our blessing. We actually should be grateful for that. Now, the principal function that God gave to civil government is to maintain justice. We know that our governments in this day and time have often gotten into many different things. They have lots of different realms that they operate within. They have a lot of different roles that they try to fulfill. But the main job is to maintain justice. And sadly, I think sometimes that's too often forgotten and neglected. Notice again in Romans chapter 13, as that text goes on, rulers are not a terror to good works, but to the evil. Wilt thou then not be afraid of the power? Do that which is good, and thou shalt have praise of the same. For he is the minister of God to thee for good. But if thou do that which is evil, be afraid. For he beareth not the sword in vain, for he is the minister of God, a revenger to execute wrath upon him that doeth evil. So in the context of saying that government is ordained of God, it specifies their role in punishing evildoers. They have that job. And again, sometimes, sadly, that is neglected, but that is their important God-given function. Peter said the same thing in 1 Peter chapter 2, beginning verse 13. Submit yourselves to every ordinance of man for the Lord's sake, whether it be to the king as supreme or unto governors as unto them that are sent by him, for the punishment of evildoers and for the praise of them that do well. Notice, they are there to punish evildoers, to praise them that do well. That's what God has ordained governments to do. All right, all of this is a review, obviously, but I think important things for us to keep in mind. But here is something that I want to talk just a little more thoroughly about in response to some questions that were asked subsequent to the lesson that Steve Klein preached for us in our gospel meeting. What can we do then? Well, I think we can and should appeal to civil government for the purposes just stated. We have certainly biblical precedents for expecting government to stand up for what is right, to punish evil. In Acts chapter 25, when Paul's life was being threatened by those conspiring Jews in Jerusalem, Paul said, I stand at Caesar's judgment seat where I ought to be judged. To the Jews have I done no wrong, and as thou very well knowest, for if I be an offender or have committed anything worthy of death, I refuse not to die. But if there be none of these things whereof these accuse me, no man may deliver me unto them. I appeal unto Caesar. And so Paul was being unjustly treated here, and he made an appeal to the civil government for remedy. These people are falsely accusing me. I haven't done what they accuse. They're trying to, and he knew that there was actually a murder plot in place to kill him. And he said, if I'm an offender or committed anything worthy of death, I refuse not to die. But he says it's not true. And I appeal my case to Caesar. So we have solid biblical precedent for the expectation that government will work for us in the realm of maintaining justice. That's their God-given role. We can and should expect it. I think, sadly, there's some obvious failures in that regard in the modern day. I think that our civil government in particular, sometimes sadly fails in the respect of maintaining justice. We're right to expect that they should do so. They often let us down in that regard. And when they fail in doing their God-given duty, here's a really important thing to say. We can criticize government's failures while showing respect. Now, this thing has to be emphasized, this condition of our criticism. This condition of our criticism must be that it be done with respect. And I really think that is the main point that Steve Klein was stressing. A lot of times we do not speak respectfully of government, of our governmental leaders. We revile them. And I think that you would agree that that happens very frequently in our world. There are actually some radio talk show hosts that I've had to quit listening to because they're just so guilty of this particular crime or sin. There's no place. So we can have very strong disagreements with our president in Washington, D.C. I do. I know that many of you do. But he still is the President of the United States, and we need to respect that office and be careful how we speak about him. This particular talk show host that I was mentioning would often refer to the moron in the White House. Well, that's just wrong. That is exactly reviling, which we need to avoid. And so we need to show respect, but I believe we can criticize the failures of governments and governors. And so this is a point of clarification that I wanted to make to all those things that Steve said that I thought were really good. I'm not disagreeing with any of the conclusions that he drew, but I do want to stress this, because this is just the other side of the coin that he didn't cover in that lesson, because it wasn't the emphasis of his lesson. But I believe that we do have authority. It is proper to criticize governments when they fail in doing their God-given assignment. In Titus chapter 3, verse 1 beginning, put them in mind to be subject to principalities and powers, to obey magistrates, to be ready to every good work. Notice, to speak evil of no man, to be no brawlers, but gentle, showing all meekness unto all men. And so he mentions, contextually, he specifically mentions principalities and powers, and he said, don't speak evil of them. Show all meekness to all men, and that would include those in roles of civil government. So again, make sure that we're not reviling. Make sure that we're not speaking evil. However, here's another example. This is a well-known one. Here's an example from the Apostle Paul. You remember when he was first arrested in Jerusalem. In Acts chapter 23, Paul earnestly beholding the council said, men and brethren, I have lived in all good conscience before God until this day. And the high priest Ananias commanded them that stood by him to smite him on the mouth. Then said Paul unto them, God shall smite thee, thou whited wall. For sittest thou to judge me after the law, and commandest me to be smitten contrary to the law? And they that stood by said, revilest thou God's high priest? Then said Paul, I wist not, brethren, that he was the high priest, for it is written, thou shalt not speak evil of the ruler of thy people. Notice, Paul responded to this man who had actually broken the law. He said, you're going to judge me after the law and commandest me to be smitten contrary to the law? So what Ananias, the high priest, had instructed people to do was a violation. He was wrong about that. He was wrong in doing that. But Paul called him a whited wall, which would have been a very derogatory comment, probably referencing the idea of a tomb or a sepulcher where inside are rotted, decaying corpses of dead people, but outside painted white to make it look pretty. And so that's very likely what he had reference to with the idea of a whited wall. But this guy had instructed his counterparts there to smite Paul. Paul said it's not legal what you just did. But even though this man had commanded Paul to be punished unjustly, Paul realized that he had made a mistake by using this derogatory expression concerning him, whited wall. He said, I know that it's written, thou shalt not speak evil of the ruler of thy people. So Paul acknowledged an error in that regard, even though this guy had failed in doing the right thing. This official, in this case he was the high priest, but this official had done the wrong thing. But even though he had done the wrong thing, Paul said, I should still speak respectfully. And there is the principle that we're trying to develop. Now here's an interesting one to add to the mix. This is an example from Jesus himself. In Luke chapter 13, beginning verse 31, the same day there came certain of the Pharisees saying unto him, get thee out and depart hence, for Herod will kill thee. And he said to them, go ye and tell that fox, behold, I cast out devils, and I do cures today and tomorrow, and the third day I shall be perfected. All right, so this was in reference to Herod the king. And some were advising Jesus, you need to get out because Herod's going to try to kill you. And Jesus said, go and tell that fox. he referred to Herod as that fox. Now, did Jesus do anything wrong there? Well, in this case, we would have to say he absolutely did not do anything wrong, right? Jesus is sinlessly perfect. And so here is an expressed criticism of Herod, the king, the civil governor. And so there's clear criticism here, but not a sinful reviling. So what we're saying is this is a pretty fine line to walk. I think Jesus walked the fine line perfectly, obviously. We would say this was without fault. But he could refer to him as a fox. In other words, paralleling Herod's character and conduct to that of a fox in the wild. Well, there's several things you could say about the attributes of a fox. But Jesus referred to Herod as a fox in this regard. Not a sinful reviling, but clearly a criticism of Herod's character and conduct in the way he was administering his office. Jesus' statement was just and direct, but it was not disrespectful. And so I really want to stress this point in response to the questions that were asked following Steve Klein's sermon. I think Steve Klein's sermon was good. I think it was much needed. We really got to be careful about reviling. But I do think we can criticize civil government. We just got to make sure in doing that we don't become disrespectful and cross the line and engage in reviling as he taught us. Real quickly then, what should we do? As servants of Christ, what should we do relative to civil government? Well, first of all, I want to suggest to you that we need to pray. And we need to pray often for those in control of our government. You know, I think we're at a real crisis time in regards to the things that are happening politically, morally, all across our society. I think we're in real troubling times, and we need to pray for those in authority. I hope that each of you will try to do that on a regular, daily basis. Pray for our rulers. Pray, let's look at the verses that tell us what to pray about. In 1 Timothy chapter 2, Verse 1, I exhort therefore that first of all, supplications, prayers, intercessions, givings of thanks be made for all men, for kings, and for all that are in authority. What? That we may lead a quiet and peaceful life in all godliness and honesty. That's the key right there, right? So we don't need to pray that our civil government will make decisions so that our 401 retirement plan will get bigger. So that the economy will prosper. So, I mean, those would all be nice things to happen, obviously, but the emphasis of our prayer is that we can lead quiet and peaceful life in all godliness and honesty. Pray for our civil leaders then, that they will do things that will promote justice and righteousness and peace. I think those would be the principal things that we want to emphasize in our prayers for our leaders. We need to pray for them. Obviously, we need to pay our taxes. I think this probably goes without saying. Jesus certainly taught us to do that. In Matthew 22, beginning verse 17, tell us therefore, they asked Jesus, what thinkest thou? Is it lawful to give tribute or taxes to Caesar or not? But Jesus perceived their wickedness and said, why tempt ye me, ye hypocrites? Show me the tribute money. And they brought unto him a penny, and he said unto them, whose is this image and superscription? And they said unto him, Caesar's. Then said he unto them, render therefore unto Caesar the things which are Caesar, and unto God the things that are God's. Jesus taught us to pay our taxes. And as we've pointed out a lot of times here, you know, we cannot use the justification, well, the government's doing some bad things with the tax money we pay, therefore I'm not going to pay my taxes. That won't work, right? Specifically because Jesus said, pay your taxes to the Romans, who definitely were doing some bad things with the money they received, but he still said, pay your taxes to them. So in that sense, Jesus excused us from any accountability as to what happens with our tax dollars once we pay them to the government. So sadly, our government funds abortions, for instance, which is so disgustingly, horrifically sinful. And I don't want my tax, I hate that any penny of the money I give the government might be used in that fashion. But here Jesus effectively excuses us from any responsibility or accountability in regards to that. And so pay your taxes. That's what we're supposed to do. In that same Romans 13 chapter, that same context about civil government, Paul says, "For this cause pay ye tribute also, for they are God's ministers. Render therefore to all their dues, tribute to whom tribute is due, custom to whom custom, fear to whom fear, honor to whom honor." Pay your taxes. Pray for them, pay your taxes. Obey the laws that the government sets down. Now this should probably be an obvious thing to us, but we need to be reminded, because there's some things that the government tells us to do that we don't necessarily like. You know, I don't know how many of you travel down Old Trotwood Avenue down toward Mount Pleasant. They changed the speed limit down there. Richard, they changed the speed limit on us. And they make it 45. They make it 45 all the way down through there. And to me, that just seems like you're just crawling. You know, and it seems like it's open country, and we ought to be able to do 55 like we always did 55 down there. I don't like that 45 mile per hour speed limit. I'm not going to do it. I can't have that objection, can I? But notice, we got to obey its laws. Matthew 26, 59 and 60. Now the chief priests and elders and all the council sought false witnesses against Jesus. Hang on a minute. That's another verse. I don't really want to come, but I want to come back this verse. 1 Peter 2, beginning verse 12. Having your conversation honest among the Gentiles, that whereas they speak against you as evildoers, they may by your good works, which they shall behold, glorify God in the day of visitation. Submit yourselves to every ordinance of man for the Lord's sake, whether it be to the king as supreme or unto governors, as unto them that are sent by him for the punishment of evildoers and for the praise of them that do well. For so is the will of God, that with well-doing ye may put to silence the ignorance of foolish men. Again, it's not just the rules that I tend to like or accept or understand. It's every ordinance. It's every ordinance. Romans 13, 5, wherefore you must needs be subject, not only for wrath, but also for conscience sake. I need to be subject to the civil authority for wrath, that is, they might punish me, but I need to be obedient to civil government because of conscience sake too. I need to not violate this instruction of God. My conscience would be affected if I knowingly violated the instruction of civil government. Great caveat, as you well know, is what the apostles said in Acts chapter 5, beginning verse 27. When they had brought them, they set them before the council, and the high priest asked them, the apostles, saying, did not we straitly command you that you should not teach in this name? And behold, ye have filled Jerusalem with your doctrine, and intend to bring this man's blood upon us. Then Peter and the other apostles answered and said, we ought to obey God rather than men. So here's some authority figures who are saying, don't say anything about Jesus. Well, that instruction was contrary to the instruction that they had received from the Lord himself. Go into all the world, preach the gospel to every creature. The authorities were saying, don't talk about Jesus anymore. The Lord had said, go into all the world, preach the gospel to every creature. So we've got instructions at odds with one another. We've got a conflict here between the instructions of the Lord and the instructions of the authorities. What do? We ought to obey God rather than men. That is an overarching principle that we always keep in mind. But short of any instruction from the civil government that forces us to violate the law of God, we should obey the law of the civil government. We need to live righteously. You know, I really think that the best thing that we can do in this present age, when there are so many concerns and worries about things that are going on in our country, in the world in general, in our country in particular, political and social issues and unrest, what can we do? Well, I actually think there's probably very little we can do in the big picture. They're not going to let me go up to Washington and have a meeting with President Biden in the Oval Office. They're just not going to allow that. I'd like to do that. I would jump at that chance, wouldn't you? If you had a chance to sit down with the president and tell him the things that you think need to be changed or done differently, wouldn't you jump at a chance to do that? I think most of us would. We're not going to get that chance. I'm simply saying that our ability to influence things at that level, almost non-existent. But we can vote. We'll talk about that in a minute. But I think the main thing that we can do is live righteously and set a right example. And in the immediate sphere of our influence, let us be an influence for good. In Romans chapter 14, verse 34, righteousness exalteth a nation, but sin is a reproach to any people. I can do this. I can live a righteous life, and to that degree, to the extent that I'm influencing things, then that's going to exalt the nation if I'm living righteously. If we're all living righteously, we're helping. We're not hurting. We're definitely helping the situation. It may seem like it's not making a whole lot of difference, but it is what difference we have the power to exercise. And so let us live righteously in the midst of this wicked world. You remember very well, Jesus said, let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father which is in heaven. Let your light so shine. We need to do that. We need to live righteously. In Philippians chapter 2, verse 15, Paul said, be blameless and harmless, the sons of God without rebuke, in the midst of a crooked and perverse nation, among whom you shine as lights in the world. You feel like you are in the midst of a crooked and perverse nation? I think a lot of us do, right? What do you do when you're living in the midst of a crooked and perverse nation? Be blameless, harmless, the sons of God without rebuke, shine as lights in the world. That's what you do. That's what you do when you find yourself in the midst of a crooked and perverse nation. All right, and then just one final point to add to this. And again, this one, in conjunction with this one, I would say that we need to emphasize, because of some questions that were sort of left open-ended when Steve Klein preached that lesson to us just a few weeks ago about reviling. I want to reiterate, I really appreciated that lesson. I thought it was very important. I needed it. And some of you have said the same thing. Because I'm confident that I have crossed that line from time to time in how I've spoken about our civil governors. And I don't want to do that. I don't want to be guilty of that sin of reviling. But I believe we can criticize the failures of government while showing respect. And I really think that not only can we, but we're actually told to, we're instructed to speak out, to teach God's truth. In Psalm 119, verse 46, the psalmist said, I will speak of thy testimonies also before kings and will not be ashamed. And so I want to suggest to you that not only are we allowed to speak out about things that we see that are wrong, I believe we're actually instructed to do so. And so I wouldn't say, well, just duck your head and go crawl in a hole. The government's going to do what the government's going to do, and you really should not even say anything about it. I don't believe that. I don't believe that's a correct conclusion. I think we can and actually are instructed to speak out when we see that wrong things are being done. We should proclaim God's truth. Again, we have limited influence in the seats of government, but we certainly have influence in our immediate community. And we need to speak of thy testimonies even before kings and not be ashamed. Part of the way that we do that, I think, is that we can use our vote, but we can also be vocal. Again, do it respectfully. Do not engage in reviling. But in regards to sins like abortion, when now they're saying something on the order of 65 million babies have been aborted in the United States since 1973. You know, that's just mind-boggling, isn't it? That many babies have been killed by abortion. I'm going to speak out about that. I'm going to say that is just absolutely wrong. And to the extent that our government authorizes it and even funds it, that's wrong. That's just wrong. And an end, they need to put an end to that. And I want to do anything that I can do, and I think you would agree, that we want to do whatever we can do to be a voice against that horrible sin. Or the sin of homosexuality that our government now is endorsing and promoting. I'm going to speak out about that, and you are too, right? We're supposed to. And so, again, criticize with respect, but speak out and teach God's truth that needs to be declared so plainly. All right. Again, that is a repeat sermon, and I think you probably recognized it. But I wanted to come back across that for the purpose of addressing some questions that were on several minds after we heard Steve's really good sermon on the sin of reviling. And I hope that that's maybe been a helpful clarification. Thanks for your good attention to what we've had to say. We'll sing this song of invitation, and as we sing this song, we'll be encouraging everybody, make sure your life is right with God. If you need our help in making it right, please say a word, and we'll be quick to assist you in whatever help you need. Let us know while we stand and sing this song.
Would you be free from your burden?